Mazatlan's police headquarters had seen better days. In November of 2024, on a crisp Monday morning, the excavators arrived. Their task was to begin the demolition of a building that had stood as a silent witness to decades of corruption and violence. The three-story structure would be replaced by a modern facility, a monument of steel and glass promising state-of-the-art technology and a new era of transparency. But before the machines could tear down the walls, the basement had to be emptied. That damp, forgotten labyrinth where the files of cases no one wanted to remember went to die. The thankless job of supervising the clean-out had fallen to Officer Martinez, a man with barely 3 years on the force. Amidst moldy boxes and rusted filing cabinets, something caught his eye. It was a metal case secured with 3 padlocks, its surface a tapestry of rust. Yet, a label remained, its warning still legible. "Do not open, level 5 classified." Curiosity, that old enemy of protocol, won the day. With a pair of bolt cutters, he snapped the locks, never imagining he was about to pry open a window into Mazatlan's darkest hell. Inside, perfectly preserved in vacuum-sealed plastic bags, was a file over 500 pages thick. The cover bore a title that would have frozen the blood in any man's veins. Operation Cleanup SS-92. The first pages were filled with surveillance photographs of an entire family, 11 people spanning 3 generations, captured from different angles at the Playa Bonita Hotel. There were transcripts of wiretapped phone calls, every private word meticulously documented. But what truly turned Martinez's legs to jelly were the execution orders, signed not only by the police commander of the era, but by the city's mayor, and a third figure identified only as the Lord of the Seas. The list of targets detailed 11 names and their ages, from 11-year-old Carmelita Mendoza to 68-year-old Don Joaquín Mendoza Hernandez. There were topographical maps marked with military precision, pinpointing locations for executions and the disposal of bodies. There were beta tapes, degraded by time but still watchable, showing the final hours of a family who had come only for a vacation. And at the very end, like a desperate final testament, was a 20-page handwritten confession from a police officer. He described every horror in chilling detail before taking his own life, just 2 days after writing the last word. Martinez felt the crushing weight of history in his hands. He glanced around the now empty basement, keenly aware that he was likely the first person in 3 decades to see these documents. His first instinct was to alert his superiors, but when he casually mentioned finding some old classified files, he saw the immediate shift in their demeanor. The nervous glances, the hurried orders to leave everything as it was, to touch nothing else. That night, working voluntary overtime, Martinez photographed every page, every photo, every map. Using his own equipment, he copied the decaying videos. He knew that by sunrise, the box and its contents would be gone forever. This file, hidden for 32 years in the rotten bowels of Mazatlan's police system, did more than document the fate of 11 innocents who made the fatal mistake of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It exposed how a Mexican Pacific paradise was turned into a coordinated slaughterhouse, where authorities and drug traffickers worked as a single, efficient machine of death. It told the story of a close-knit family who, seeking only sun and sand, found their total extinction, all because they saw something they were never meant to see. If you have ever vacationed in Mazatlan, or any of Mexico's sun-drenched coastal towns, this story might make you question the paradise you thought you knew. What this file reveals about the narco-government collusion of the 90s echoes with a terrifying relevance today. A plea for justice for the countless families who have disappeared, and a testament to the stories that are never meant to be told. In 1992, Mazatlán was not the family-friendly destination its glossy brochures advertised. The Pearl of the Pacific, as it liked to be called, lived a sinister duality that everyone knew but no one spoke of. By day, its golden beaches welcomed thousands of tourists who basked in the sun and feasted on giant shrimp, charmed by Sinaloan hospitality. By night, those same beaches served as offloading points for tons of Colombian cocaine pouring in from the Pacific. The luxurious hotels of the Golden Zone didn't just host innocent vacationers. Their most exclusive suites were command centers where routes were planned, money was laundered, and lives were decided. The port was a strategic jewel for the Pacific Cartel, which was then consolidating its dominion over the maritime routes. The city's geography, with its many islands, hidden coves, and access to both sea and mountains, made it the perfect hub for moving merchandise. The authorities didn't just turn a blind eye. They were an integral part of the operation. Municipal police served as lookouts, reporting suspicious movements not to their superiors, but to their true masters. Elements within the Navy diverted patrols just as major shipments were arriving. The municipal government collected its cut and provided institutional protection. This dual economy ran with the precision of a Swiss watch. Seafood restaurants washed money while serving grilled fish. Tour agencies organized island trips that just so happened to coincide with offloading schedules. Taxi drivers reported on tourists who asked too many questions. It was a perfect criminal ecosystem where every component had its function, and Holy Week, with its flood of tourists, provided the perfect cover for moving extraordinary amounts of drugs. While Mexican families celebrated the Passion of Christ, hell was operating at full capacity. Into this world of institutionalized rot walked the Mendoza-Salazar family. 11 innocent souls, unaware they were stepping into a mortal trap. They were the perfect portrait of a hard-working, middle-class Mexican family, the kind that saves all year for the luxury of a vacation. 3 generations, bound by blood and affection, each with their own dreams, none imagining this would be their last journey together. Don Joaquín Mendoza Hernández, the 68-year-old patriarch, had dedicated his entire life to Mexico's national railways. 4 decades of climbing on and off trains, of crisscrossing the country from Mexicali to Tapachula. He was a man of the old school, one who believed in honest work, in the power of one's word, and that effort always yielded reward. His back was stooped from years of hauling luggage, and his face was weathered by the sun of 1,000 journeys. But nothing could hide the profound satisfaction of seeing his entire family gathered around him. Doña Carmen Salazar de Mendoza, 65, was the family's emotional pillar. A woman of daily rosaries and a firm hand, she had raised her children with a blend of unconditional love and iron discipline. She was an exceptional cook, a tireless weaver of blankets, and a confidant to all. She had organized this trip to celebrate her 45th wedding anniversary, insisting that everyone be present. She possessed that unique intuition of Mexican mothers, a sense that time was growing short, that the opportunities to be together were becoming more precious than gold. She had no idea how right she was. Roberto Mendoza-Salazar, at 42, was the eldest son. He had inherited his father's discipline and his mother's intelligence. A civil engineer, he worked for the Ministry of Communications, overseeing the construction of federal highways. He was Don Joaquín's pride, the son who had gone further, who wore a tie and had an office of his own. Roberto documented everything obsessively, a professional habit from years of measuring and recording. He had bought a new Sony Handycam specifically for this trip, his new toy. He wanted to capture every moment for a time when the grandparents would no longer be with them. The cruel irony of fate was that his recordings would become evidence of his own family's destruction. Elena Gutierrez de Mendoza, 40, Roberto's wife, was a primary school teacher by vocation and a mother by devotion. For 15 years, she had shaped young minds in a public school in Guadalajara, earning the love of generations of students who remembered her as the teacher who never lost her patience. She was the perfect balance to Roberto's meticulous nature, bringing warmth and spontaneity to their home. Her maternal instinct had led her to organize every detail of the trip, from her father-in-law's medication to the beach toys for the little ones, ensuring everyone's comfort. Miguel Mendoza-Salazar, the 38-year-old younger son, was the perfect contrast to his older brother. A charming bachelor and an accountant at a private firm, he lived with a contagious joy that made him a favorite among his nieces and nephews. He was the uncle who arrived with gifts, who told off-color jokes when the parents weren't listening. He had paid for half the trip as an anniversary gift to his parents, a gesture typical of his impulsive generosity. For him, this trip was a way to reconnect, to feel part of something larger than his weekend conquests. The third generation brought the vibrant energy of youth. Roberto Jr., 17, was the spitting image of his father at that age, serious, studious, and dreaming of following in his footsteps. He carried his Sony Walkman everywhere, recording conversations and ambient sounds, creating what he called sound documentaries. Ana Helena, 15, had just celebrated her quinceañera 2 months prior. She dreamed of becoming a doctor and kept a diary filled with teenage poems about love and life, never knowing her words on eternity would soon take on a tragic meaning. Luis Miguel, 14, was pure, uncontained energy. A soccer player and an adventurer, he was always exploring, always poking his nose where it didn't belong. His insatiable curiosity would, tragically, trigger the family's catastrophe. Carmelita, at 11, was the baby of the family, a quiet, observant girl with an exceptional talent for drawing. In her sketches, the family was always holding hands, an unbreakable chain. Reality would prove that the chain would bind them together, even in death. Then there were the twins, Diego and Daniel Torres Mendoza, 16. Technically nephews, they had been adopted by Roberto and Elena after losing their parents in a car accident 3 years earlier. Inseparable, they had found in the Mendozas the stability they desperately needed, and their loyalty to their new family was absolute. The trip had been planned for months. They rented a Chevrolet van in Guadalajara, large enough for all 11 of them. The 8-hour drive was an adventure in itself. Roberto and Miguel took turns at the wheel while Doña Carmen passed around her famous homemade sandwiches. The kids fought over the radio, alternating between Luis Miguel's ballads and Spanish rock. Roberto filmed it all with his new camera, his father telling old stories, his mother scolding him for filming while they ate, the kids making faces at the lens, footage that would later become exhibits in a classified file. They arrived in Mazatlán at sunset on April 7th, the sinking sun painting the Pacific in shades of gold and fire. The Hotel Playa Bonita was not the most luxurious, but it was clean, family-oriented, and right on the beach. 3 adjoining rooms on the second floor with an ocean view had cost months of savings, but it was worth it to see the look on the grandparents' faces. Don Joaquín and Doña Carmen wept quietly as they looked out at the ocean, as emotional as children. It was the first time Doña Carmen had ever seen the Pacific. The children didn't even wait to unpack. Within minutes, they were racing toward the shore. Luis Miguel was the first to hit the water, shouting with joy. The twins followed, ever protective. Ana Helena posed for photos while Carmelita built intricate sandcastles. Inside, Elena efficiently organized the rooms. Miguel joked that he might finally meet an American tourist without having to explain himself to anyone. The air was filled with laughter and the promise of a perfect vacation. No one noticed the men on the balcony of the adjacent hotel, photographing them with telephoto lenses. No one saw the exact moment their names were checked off a list. No one heard the call that went out. Family of 11 includes an engineer from SCT, rooms 201, 202, and 203. Routine surveillance initiated. The tourist paradise had already begun to weave its mortal web around the Mendoza-Salazar family. Wednesday, April 8th, Day 1. The calm before the storm. Their first full day of vacation dawned perfect, with the brilliant sun that makes the Mexican Pacific famous. The Mendoza-Salazar family gathered in the hotel restaurant for the included breakfast buffet. The typical family squabbles began immediately. The teenagers wanted to rent jet skis, an activity Doña Carmen deemed both dangerous and expensive. The grandparents preferred to simply sit under a palapa and enjoy the sea breeze. Roberto wanted to film everything while Elena insisted he put the camera down and live in the moment. Miguel mediated with his characteristic humor, suggesting they split up by age, a proposal that was unanimously rejected as the whole point was to be together. Finally, they reached a typically Mexican compromise, a morning on the beach to please everyone, followed by an afternoon exploring the city. The morning passed in that familial peace achieved only when 3 generations coexist in harmony. Roberto recorded hours of footage, the twins burying Luis Miguel in the sand until he looked like a mermaid. Ana, Elena, and Carmelita competing to see who could find the prettiest shells. Don Joaquín teaching Roberto Jr. to identify the different types of seabirds he had known from his travels. Doña Carmen, seated under her umbrella with her eternal knitting, supervised everything with that eagle eye grandmothers possess, capable of detecting danger or mischief from 100 meters away. Miguel rented a boogie board and tried to impress some tourists from Sonora, only to be tumbled by the waves, much to the amusement of his nephews. Elena obsessively applied sunscreen to everyone, especially Carmelita, whose fair skin burned at the mere thought of the sun. The vendor selling mango with chili passed by, and Don Joaquín bought some for everyone, haggling on principle, though the price was reasonable. The children from the neighboring hotel joined an impromptu game of beach soccer, where Luis Miguel shone with 3 goals, celebrating as if he were in the Azteca Stadium. Lunch was served at the beachside palapas, grilled pescado zarandeado and shrimp in garlic sauce. Don Joaquín told the story of when he worked on the construction of the railway branch to Mazatlán in 1954, when the city was little more than a large fishing village. The young ones listened with that typical blend of respect and boredom, while the adults marveled at the patriarch's prodigious memory, recalling the names of his colleagues, exact dates, even the menu from the workers' canteen. In the afternoon, the tour of the Malecón revealed the duality of Mazatlán. On one hand, the undeniable beauty of the seaside promenade, the cliff divers risking their lives for tips, the street musicians playing sinaloense for the tourists. On the other, to an observant eye, there were signs of the other business. Men with radios who looked neither like tourists nor locals. SUVs with tinted windows parked strategically, gazes that lingered a moment too long. Roberto, with his engineer's mind accustomed to detecting patterns, noticed something was off, but he chalked it up to urban paranoia. In the family videos that would later become part of the case file, several men can be clearly seen following the family at a discreet distance. One is seen speaking into a radio just as Roberto pulls out his SCT ID to get a discount at the aquarium. Another takes photos when Don Joaquín loudly mentions to a vendor that he knew Culiacán back in his railroad days. A third jots notes in a pad when Miguel jokes about knowing someone important in Guadalajara who could get them a boat for free. The dinner at Los Arcos would be the family's last complete happy meal together. A table for 11 on the terrace overlooking the sea, the sunset painting everything in hues of orange and purple. Roberto made an emotional toast to his parents, thanking them for 45 years of marriage that had been an example to them all. Elena cried discreetly. Miguel told off-color jokes that earned a scolding from Doña Carmen, who tried not to laugh. The teenagers shared a giant banana split that ended in a cherry war. Ana Elena confessed to her cousin Carmelita that she had a crush on a boy from her school. Roberto Jr. recorded the ambiance with his audio recorder, wanting to capture not just images but sounds for his family documentary. In that recording, preserved in the case file, voices that did not belong to the family can be heard clearly beneath the chatter and music. Confirm identity of the engineer. SCT, Federal Highways. Could be a problem. The boss wants to know if he's the same one who supervised the Sierra project. Maintain level 2 surveillance. Roberto Jr. focused on recording his family, never noticed those voices. If he had heard them, had understood them, perhaps they would have had a chance to flee. Perhaps. The night ended with a walk along the beach, the 11 of them forming a line, arm in arm, the waves washing over their feet. Don Joaquín and Doña Carmen were in the center, their children on either side, the grandchildren at the ends. An image any Mexican family would recognize. That perfect moment when 3 generations feel as one. Roberto filmed from behind, capturing their silhouettes against the full moon. In the case file, it would be the last image of the 11 of them, alive and free. Thursday, April 9th, the encounter with horror. Holy Thursday dawned overcast, a rarity for Mazatlán in April. Doña Carmen took it as a divine sign that they should go to Mass, and though not everyone was particularly religious, no one dared contradict the matriarch during Holy Week. The Mazatlán Cathedral was packed with faithful and tourists alike. The family took up 2 full pews, drawing attention for their size and cohesion in an era when large families were becoming a rarity. The priest delivered a sermon on the betrayal of Judas and the sacrifice of Christ. Doña Carmen wept during the most emotional passages, holding the hand of Don Joaquín, who, though not very religious himself, deeply respected his wife's faith. The young ones stoically endured the 90-minute ceremony. Luis Miguel doodled discreetly in the missal. The twins dozed, and Ana Elena actually paid attention. Upon leaving, the decision of what to do with the rest of the day came spontaneously when they saw advertisements for tours to the islands. "We should see the islands," suggested Miguel, ever the adventurer. Roberto calculated the cost for 11 people and nearly choked, but Don Joaquín, in a rare burst of generosity, announced that it was his treat. "After all, what am I saving for at this stage of my life?" he joked, unaware of the tragic irony in his words. They hired 2 boats from a local who promised a complete tour of Deer Island, Bird Island, and Wolf Island, with a stop for swimming and a picnic. The boats departed at 11 in the morning. The sea was choppier than usual, which only added to the excitement. Luis Miguel and the twins rowed in the bow of one boat, shouting every time a wave splashed them. The women were more sheltered in the center, though Ana Elena convinced her mother to let her go up front with the boys. Roberto filmed everything, fascinated by the geography of the approaching islands. Don Joaquín told the boatmen about his experience transporting materials for the island's lighthouse. Back in the 50s, Deer Island seemed deserted when they arrived. The boatman explained that on weekdays during the off-season, almost no one came. He showed them a perfect little beach for swimming, shaded by palm trees with sand as white as sugar. They agreed he would return for them at 4 in the afternoon. The family settled in as if they were moving in for good. Towels spread out, a cooler filled with drinks, food prepared that morning by Elena and Doña Carmen. Paradise seemed complete. It was Luis Miguel, of course, who suggested exploring. "There's a hill over there," he said, pointing toward the island's interior. "I bet you can see the whole ocean from the top." The twins, his perpetual shadows, immediately seconded the idea. The adults were too comfortable to move, and the other teenagers showed no interest. "Don't go too far," Elena warned with her maternal instinct. "And don't be long," Roberto added without taking his eyes off the sea he was filming. The three boys set off toward what would be the beginning of the end. The path was longer than it looked. The vegetation grew denser as they moved away from the beach. Luis Miguel led the way, flanked by the twins, the three of them joking about finding pirate treasure. It was Diego who heard the voices first. He signaled for silence, and the three of them instinctively crouched down. The voices were coming from a hidden cove on the other side of the rocks. Curious as only teenagers can be, they crept closer, thinking they might find a couple in a compromising position. Perfect material for later teasing. What they saw left them frozen. A speedboat was anchored in the cove. Men were unloading rectangular packages wrapped in black plastic, stacking them on the sand. Other men, clearly armed with assault rifles, guarded the perimeter. In the center of the group, a blond American in his 40s was arguing heatedly with a Mexican man in a white suit who appeared to be the boss. The American gesticulated furiously, pointing at the packages. Suddenly he pulled something from his jacket. A badge. "DEA," he shouted in accented Spanish. "This is over. You're all under arrest." The response was instantaneous and brutal. The man in white didn't even have to give the order. The sicarios simply opened fire. The DEA agent was cut down in a hail of bullets before he could even draw his weapon. His body convulsed from the impact of dozens of rounds, the sand around him turning red. When he stopped moving, the boss walked over and delivered a final shot to his head. "Fucking stupid gringo," he spat on the corpse. "Julio, Marco, dig the hole deep and throw some lime in it." The three boys were petrified. They had seen movies, played violent video games, but nothing had prepared them to witness a real murder. Luis Miguel's brain processed the scene in slow motion. The blood spreading across the sand, the inert body, the men digging with routine efficiency. The twins looked at each other with the silent language only they understood, both reaching the same conclusion. They had to get out of there. Now. They began to back away with infinite care. 1 step, 2, 3. Then Luis Miguel, the agile soccer player who never stumbled on the field, stepped on a dry branch. The crack sounded like a gunshot in the island's silence. Every head snapped in their direction. For a second that felt like an eternity. No one moved. Then the boss screamed, "Someone's there! Get them!" Survival instinct took over. The three boys ran as they had never run before. The twins, taller and more athletic, took the lead. Luis Miguel, despite his fitness, began to fall behind, terror partially paralyzing his muscles. Behind them, shouts, curses, the unmistakable sound of weapons being readied. The vegetation that had seemed friendly before was now a disorienting labyrinth. Branches slapped their faces, roots tripped them, but they couldn't stop. Diego and Daniel reached the beach first, screaming incoherently. The family, drowsy from the sun and food, took precious seconds to react. Roberto was the first to understand that something was terribly wrong. He stood up just in time to see Luis Miguel burst from the vegetation, pursued closely by armed men. His son was 50 meters away when the first sicario caught him, felling him with a rifle butt to the back. "Luis Miguel!" Roberto's cry alerted everyone. The engineer ran toward his son without a thought for the danger. Elena screamed and followed him. Miguel tried to stop her, but she broke free with unexpected strength. Don Joaquín, at 68 and with bad knees, rose laboriously but with determination. Doña Carmen began to pray aloud, her rosary trembling in her hands. Ana Elena and Carmelita clung to each other, not fully understanding but sensing the terror. The twins were frozen, the shock of what they had witnessed blocking any reaction. Roberto reached the spot where the sicarios held Luis Miguel. The boy's nose was bleeding, his eyes wide with fear. "Please," Roberto said, pulling out his SCT identification with trembling hands. "I'm a government engineer. We didn't see anything. We won't say anything. Please, he's my son. He's only 14. His professional voice, the one he used in important meetings, tried to remain calm, but the tremor betrayed him. The sicario who seemed to be in charge looked at him with something resembling annoyance. "SCT engineer," he repeated, and for a moment Roberto thought that might save them. Then the sicario smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The same son of a bitch who supervised the Sierra Highway project, right? The one they didn't want running where we needed it to." The punch landed before Roberto could process the words, breaking his nose. He fell to his knees, blood staining his good shirt. Elena ran up and threw herself over her husband. "No, please, we're a family. We have children." The sicarios brutally shoved her aside. She tried to resist and received a rifle butt to the stomach that left her breathless. Ana Elena screamed when she saw her mother on the ground and ran toward her, only to be intercepted by another sicario who grabbed her arm with brutal force. The rest happened with the efficiency of a military operation. The sicarios surrounded the family with trained precision. Miguel tried to negotiate, offering all the money they had, their credit cards, anything. They silenced him with a blow. Don Joaquín, in a surge of elderly valor, tried to face the aggressors with his fists, cursing with words his grandchildren had never heard him utter. It took 3 men to subdue him, and even then he managed to break one of their noses before they beat him into a state of semi-consciousness. Doña Carmen never stopped praying, not for a moment, even as they tied her up. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." Her voice, clear and strong, was a stark contrast to the surrounding chaos. Some of the hitmen involuntarily crossed themselves, the power of a praying grandmother striking some long-buried chord from their own childhoods. Carmelita wept in silence, clutching a rag doll she had brought with her. The twins, these boys who had lost their parents and were now losing their adoptive family, clasped hands just as they had as children, their hearts filled with fear. As the hitmen tied up the family, the boss they had seen executing the DEA agents arrived. The man in the white suit, now stained with blood, assessed the situation with cold, professional detachment. "How many?" he asked. 11, boss, the whole family, 3 generations," the lead sicario reported. The boss swore viciously. 11 witnesses was a major problem, a problem that required consultation with higher-ups. The satellite phone call lasted 10 minutes. 10 minutes during which the Mendoza-Salazar family remained bound in the sand, under the merciless sun, surrounded by armed men. 10 minutes in which each of them processed in their own way how their Easter vacation had turned into a nightmare. 10 minutes that would decide their fate. When the boss hung up, his expression left no room for doubt. "Orders from the top," he announced. "Total cleanup, no exceptions, make it look like they were never here." An entire family condemned for witnessing a murder. 11 lives, from children to grandparents, sacrificed to protect a narco operation. If this is not enough to demand justice, what is? Share this video now, comment to honor their memory. The story gets worse, much worse. Friday, April 10th, the systematic disappearance. The night between Thursday and Friday was the longest of the Mendoza-Salazar family's 11 lives. They had been transported to a makeshift warehouse on an uninhabited part of the island, a windowless cinder block structure that had once been used to store fishing equipment. The space, no more than 20 square meters, now held 11 bound people, some injured, all terrified. The heat was suffocating, the air thin, and the smell of fear was palpable. Don Joaquín had regained consciousness, but his face was unrecognizable from the beating. Doña Carmen, sitting beside him, cleaned the blood with the hem of her dress while whispering prayers and words of comfort. Roberto had a broken nose and possibly some fractured ribs. Every breath was an agony. Elena, despite the pain in her stomach, tried to stay calm for her children, whispering that everything would be all right. Pious lies she didn't believe herself. The young ones were in various states of shock. Luis Miguel, the unwitting trigger of the tragedy, hadn't spoken a word since their capture, consumed by guilt. The twins remained together, communicating with their eyes, mentally preparing for what they both sensed would be their final destination. Roberto Jr. watched everything with the analytical mind inherited from his father, memorizing faces, voices, any detail that might be useful if... No. When they got out of this. Ana Elena hugged Carmelita, trying to be the strong older sister while crumbling inside. The 11-year-old girl had entered an almost catatonic state, clinging to her doll as if it were a life raft. Miguel was the only one still trying to negotiate with the guards who took turns watching them. "Listen, my friends," he'd say with his natural charisma, trying to break the ice. "This is a misunderstanding. We didn't see anything. Well, the boys saw something, but they're kids. They don't know what they saw. We can fix this. I have connections, money. My brother works for the government, but he's just an engineer. He builds roads. He's not a cop or anything." The guards ignored him. Some even seemed uncomfortable with the situation. At dawn, the movement began. The sicarios received orders to move the family. The original plan to execute them on the island and dispose of the bodies there had been scrapped. It was too close to tourist routes, too much risk of remains washing up with the currents. They needed to take them to more controlled territory. The problem was how to move 11 people without attracting attention, especially with some so visibly beaten. The solution was to sedate them. Using veterinary drugs stolen from a cattle ranch, they injected each family member. The children first, to the horror of their parents. Carmelita didn't even protest as the needle entered her arm. Ana Helena tried to resist, but it was useless. The twins asked to be sedated at the same time, their final act of brotherhood. Luis Miguel looked at his father before closing his eyes, a silent apology for his fatal curiosity. The adults were more difficult. Helena had to be held down by 3 men as she screamed for her children. Roberto tried to reason until the very last moment, offering information on alternative routes, future projects, anything. Miguel cursed creatively, promising revenge, invoking contacts he didn't have. Don Joaquín, with the dignity of his years, simply asked that they not separate the family. "If you're going to kill us together," he said, his voice broken but firm. Doña Carmen was the last, insisting on giving a blessing to each of her unconscious grandchildren before accepting the injection. The transfer was made on a yacht confiscated in some prior operation. The unconscious bodies were loaded like cargo, piled carelessly in the boat's hold. The plan was simple: sail into international waters, execute them, and weigh the bodies down with chains and cement. Let the Pacific Ocean keep their secret forever. But Roberto, even under sedation, had managed to activate something before losing consciousness. As an engineer for the SCT, he carried an emergency device, a radio locator activated by a panic button, standard equipment for those supervising projects in remote areas. He had activated it with his last conscious effort, hoping against all hope that anyone would pick up the signal. And someone did. A Mexican Navy patrol conducting routine Easter week exercises detected the distress signal. Protocol demanded they investigate. The yacht was spotted on radar, sailing erratically with no visible flag. The patrol boat moved in for a routine inspection. Aboard the yacht, panic erupted. They couldn't have a confrontation with the Navy with 11 sedated civilians in the hold. They couldn't explain their human cargo. They couldn't risk the Navy, which had elements less corrupt than the local police, discovering the operation. The yacht's captain made a desperate decision. He changed course toward a known cove north of Mazatlán, pushing the engines to their maximum. The Navy patrol followed for a time, but then, receiving a more urgent emergency call, courtesy of the cartel's contacts within the institution, they had to abandon the pursuit. The yacht reached the cove at sunset, where vehicles and more hitmen were already waiting. The family, still unconscious, was moved to a ranch on the outskirts of Mazatlán. Not just any ranch, but a facility used to process drugs, complete with industrial crematoriums for disposing of evidence and enemies. When they began to wake, hours later, their fate was already sealed. The orders from Culiacán had been explicit and detailed. They were not only to be eliminated, every trace of their existence was to be erased. Saturday, April 11th, Operation Cleanup. The file Operation Cleanup SS-92 documented with bureaucratic precision every step of the plan to make the Mendoza-Salazars disappear. It was an operation that involved not only cartel sicarios, but an entire network of corrupt officials, municipal and judicial police, transit officers, civil registry clerks, hotel employees, and even workers at clandestine crematoriums. A perfectly coordinated machine of disappearance, one that had been used before and would be used again. Saturday began at 5 in the morning with the separation of the family. It was deliberately cruel, designed to shatter any remaining resistance. The men were taken to one end of the ranch, the women and children to the other. The cries of protest, the pleas, the attempts to fight back were all useless. For many, the last image they had of their loved ones was of them being dragged away in opposite directions. The adult men were first. Roberto, Miguel, and Don Joaquín were loaded onto a pickup truck with sacks of quicklime in the back. The destination was an abandoned mine 50 kilometers from Mazatlán. La Esperanza, it was called. Hope, a cruelly ironic name for its final purpose. During the drive, Roberto never stopped talking, not begging but reasoning. He explained that his disappearance would be noted, that the SCT would look for him, that there were protocols. Miguel alternated between offering impossible bribes and colorful curses. Don Joaquín, semi-conscious from the beatings and his age, murmured the names of train stations, his mind taking refuge in memories of his life on the rails. At the mine, the grave was already prepared, 6 meters deep, 3 meters wide. Quicklime at the bottom and more ready to cover them. Roberto made one last attempt to escape when they pulled him from the truck. With his legs injured from the day before, he didn't get far. 3 shots to the back stopped him at 20 meters. He crawled another 5 before a final shot ended the life of the engineer, who only wanted to give his family a vacation. Miguel asked for a confession, a last request from a cultural Catholic finding his faith in the face of death. It was denied. His last words, according to the file, were, "Take care of the children." Don Joaquín woke up completely just before the end. His last cry was the name of his wife, Carmen, echoing off the walls of the mine before the final silence. The teenage boys were next, Roberto Jr. and the twins, Diego and Daniel. At 16 and 17, they were almost men but still boys. Roberto Jr. had inherited his father's courage and intelligence. During the transport, he never stopped shouting out data, license plate numbers he'd memorized, names he'd overheard. He described each sicario with photographic precision. He knew he was going to die, but he wanted the information to survive somehow. The twins, faithful to the end, held hands as they were pulled from the vehicle. Their destination was different: an industrial crematorium at another ranch, normally used for processing drug waste. It was the preferred method when they needed absolutely nothing left behind. The three boys faced their end together, Roberto Jr. shouting truths until the first shot silenced them. The twins died as they had lived, united, falling one on top of the other in a final embrace. The adult women were processed with the same ruthless efficiency. Elena and Doña Carmen, the daughter-in-law and mother-in-law who had loved each other like mother and daughter, were taken together to the Barranca del Diablo, the Devil's Ravine. During the drive, Elena never stopped asking about her children. "Are they okay? Did you give them food? Ana Elena has diabetes. She needs her medicine. Carmelita is afraid of the dark. Is someone with her?" A mother's instinct surviving even in the face of knowing she would never see them again. Doña Carmen prayed the entire rosary, each mystery offered for a member of her family. At the ravine, a 200-meter drop to a river that eventually led to the sea, the two women held hands. The file includes a handwritten note from one of the sicarios. "The old lady blessed us before she fell. Said God would forgive us, that we didn't know what we were doing." Elena screamed Roberto's name as she fell. Doña Carmen died as she had lived, praying. The girls were the last. Ana Elena, 15, her whole life ahead of her, dreams of becoming a doctor. Carmelita, 11, the family's artist, the quiet observer. Even the most hardened sicarios had difficulty with this. The head of the operation, in a fit of what he considered mercy, ordered them to be heavily sedated beforehand. They died in their sleep, without knowing, without suffering the final terror. Their bodies also went to the crematorium, 2 hours at maximum temperature, and nothing was left of the girls who just wanted a vacation at the beach. But Operation Cleanup didn't end with the executions. Simultaneously, another team worked to erase any trace of the family's existence in Mazatlán. A fake hotel checkout was registered for 6 a.m. on Thursday the 9th. Before the incident on the island, the toll booth records were altered to show the family's van had left Mazatlán that morning. A sicario who vaguely resembled Roberto was filmed by security cameras at gas stations in Tepic and Guadalajara, creating a false trail. The family's belongings were meticulously collected from the hotel and incinerated. The clothes, the toys, Roberto's video camera, Roberto Jr.'s tape recorder, Ana Helena's diary, Carmelita's drawings, all turned to ash. The rooms were cleaned with industrial products, erasing fingerprints, hair, any DNA evidence. By the time they were finished, it was as if the Mendoza-Salazars had never been there. 11 people, 3 generations, erased as if they had never existed. They were not only murdered, their memory, their honor was erased. If you have a family, if you have traveled in Mexico, if you believe in justice, you must share this. Like this, furiously, comment demanding that the Mendoza-Salazars be recognized. Activate the notification bell, because this is only half the story. The days following Easter week of 1992 brought the first wave of concern to Guadalajara. The Mendoza-Salazars were supposed to have returned on the night of April 12th. When Monday dawned with no news, Jorge Gutierrez, Helena's brother, was the first to be alarmed. He knew his sister. She always called if there was a change of plans. He called the Playa Bonita Hotel. The answer bewildered him. The family had checked out early on Thursday, apparently deciding to cut their vacation short. But that made no sense. Why cut short a trip planned for months? Why not tell anyone? Jorge began to make the calls to Roberto's office at the SCT, where he had missed work without a word, to the firm where Miguel worked, the same unexplained absence, to the neighbors who hadn't seen the van return, to the boys' school where they never showed up for class. 11 people couldn't simply vanish. On Tuesday, a telegram arrived at Jorge's house. Something came up. Visiting family in Tepic. Back soon. Roberto. The message was jarring. They had no family in Tepic, and Roberto never used telegrams. He would have called. On Wednesday, another telegram, this time from Guadalajara. Grandfather ill. In hospital. Don't worry. Miguel. But Jorge had already checked every hospital in Guadalajara. No Joaquín Mendoza was registered. By Friday, Jorge was frantic. He convinced his wife and 2 cousins to drive to Mazatlán. They arrived on Saturday the 18th, a week after the disappearance. The hotel stuck to its story. The family had checked out early on Thursday morning. No, they hadn't left anything behind. Yes, the bill was paid in full. No, they didn't say where they were going. The manager, nervous but firm, showed them the ledger. Everything seemed to be in order. 2 in order. The municipal police were the next stop. Commander Elizalde, the same man who had signed the execution orders, received Jorge personally. With a look of paternal concern, he took the report, promised a thorough investigation, and assigned his best men. Of course, they found nothing. Sometimes families have problems we don't know about, Elizalde suggested, his voice laced with false sympathy. Perhaps your brother-in-law had debts, pressures. Mexico is a big country. It's easy to disappear if you want to. But Jorge refused to give up. He spent his life savings hiring a private detective from Mexico City. The man, a former federal agent with contacts, found the first hairline fractures in the official story. The toll booth cameras, which supposedly showed the van leaving the state, had footage that was curiously blurry. The telegrams were sent from offices where no one remembered the sender. Stranger still, Roberto's and Miguel's bank accounts had been emptied, but the withdrawals were made from ATMs in cities the family had supposedly never visited. At the SCT, Roberto's colleagues started their own inquiry. Roberto was loved and respected. They refused to believe the rumor now beginning to circulate that he had embezzled funds. Engineer Rodriguez, his best friend, discovered something disturbing. Roberto's last project had been supervising a highway in the Sierra de Sinaloa, a highway that, by sheer coincidence, bypassed the routes certain powerful interests wanted to keep open, a highway that complicated trafficking routes, a highway that made enemies. 1993 brought the first veiled threats. Jorge received an anonymous call. Stop looking, or your family is next. He found photos of his own children tucked under the windshield wiper of his car. The message was clear. The private detective vanished without collecting his final payment. Engineer Rodriguez had an accident that left him in a wheelchair. The schoolteacher who was Elena's best friend received a single bullet in the mail. The message was understood: forget or share their fate. For 5 years, silence reigned. But Jorge could not forget. In 1998, with a change in the federal government, he tried again. He traveled to Mexico City and secured a meeting with the deputy attorney general. He presented everything: the inconsistencies, the threats, the patterns. The official listened, took notes, and promised action. 2 weeks later, Jorge received an envelope. Inside were official documents proving that Roberto had been executed in Texas for drug trafficking, and that the family had been deported to Guatemala, where they died in a bus accident. The papers were all forgeries, but they bore authentic government seals. Elena's colleagues at the elementary school kept her memory alive more subtly. Every year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, they published a small memorial notice in the local paper. In memory of the Mendoza-Salazar family, absent but not forgotten. In 2000, the day after the notice was published, the school principal found a bullet on his desk. There were no more memorials. The new millennium brought new technology and with it, new hope. Don Joaquín's nephews, now young men, learned to use the internet. They created a rudimentary website with the few family photos that remained. The story began to circulate in forums for the disappeared. People from all over Mexico shared similar stories of entire families who had simply ceased to exist, always accompanied by official explanations that made no sense. Lupita Hernandez had been Roberto Jr.'s first love. At 15, they had promised to wait for each other. She kept her promise in the most tragic way. She never married, always waiting for news that never came. In 2005, using her own savings, she hired another private detective. This one was more careful, more discreet. He spent months in Mazatlán, posing as a tourist, talking to old fishermen, retired taxi drivers, and elderly prostitutes whose memories were long. He found fragments. A fisherman recalled that for 3 days in April of '92, all boat trips to Deer Island were canceled. A military operation, they told him, but he never saw any soldiers. A woman who had been a cleaner at the Playa Bonita Hotel remembered a special cleaning of 3 rooms, conducted by men who weren't regular staff, using chemicals that burned the nose. A retired taxi driver swore he'd seen a convoy of black SUVs leaving the port before dawn on Saturday the 11th, escorting a van that looked just like the one they were looking for. The detective compiled everything into a 200-page report. He never delivered it. He disappeared in October of 2005. His body was found 3 months later on a highway in Nayarit. The authorities ruled it a traffic accident. His office had been emptied, his computer gone. Lupita received a single photo in the mail, a picture of herself, walking out of her house. She needed no further message. 2010 began with renewed hope. The federal government had declared a war on drugs. Surely now there would be justice. Jorge, now in his 60s, made one last attempt. With the help of a human rights organization, he presented the case to the Attorney General's office. The response was devastating in its creativity. The official story now claimed that Roberto had been a drug trafficker all along, that he had used his position at the SCT to facilitate routes, that the family had fled with him when he was discovered, that they were probably in Colombia or dead in some cartel settling of scores. 32 years of lies, threats, and lives destroyed in the search for truth. The contents of the file, Operation Limpieza SS-92, were overwhelming in their detail. 500 pages of bureaucratic horror, where every step in the elimination of the Mendoza-Salazar family had been documented with professional pride. It was not a confession of a crime. It was a manual on how to disappear people in Mexico with institutional support. The first 50 pages contained detailed profiles of each victim, compiled before they had even arrived in Mazatlán. Roberto Mendoza-Salazar was marked in red from the start. SCT engineer, supervised Sierra Madre Occidental Highway Project, 1990 to 1991. Refused bribes, modified route, affecting cartel interests. High priority if he appears in the zone of operations. His work ID photo was clipped next to maps of the highways he had supervised, with notations marking where the final route had complicated the flow of narcotics. Elena was listed as necessary collateral. Her profile detailed her work as a teacher, her community connections, the names of her closest friends. A handwritten note in the margin read, "Eliminate quickly. High risk of persistent search due to strong social network." There were photos of her, taken with a telephoto lens in Guadalajara, entering the school at the market with her children. Someone had been watching her for months. The profiles of the children were especially chilling in their coldness. Luis Miguel, 14 years old, athletic, impulsive, potential problematic witness, do not underestimate physical capability. Ana Elena, 15 years old, intelligent, observant, risk of memorizing details, eliminate quickly. Carmelita, 11 years old, artistic, highly observant, has sketched faces of surveillance team in Guadalajara, seize and destroy all artistic production. They had even evaluated the threat posed by an 11-year-old girl. The following pages documented the surveillance from the moment they arrived. Photos taken from an adjacent hotel showed the family on the beach. Roberto building a sandcastle with Carmelita. Elena putting sunscreen on a protesting Luis Miguel. The grandparents under an umbrella. Don Joaquín dozing while Doña Carmen knitted. The twins and Roberto Jr. playing volleyball. Miguel flirting with tourists. Scenes of normal family happiness, each one marked with a date, a time, and an observation. The transcripts of the hotel wiretaps were invasive in their intimacy. Roberto calling the SCT to confirm there would be no problem extending their trip by one day. Elena talking to her brother Jorge, telling him how happy the grandparents were. Miguel making a dinner reservation, specifying that there would be 11 people, 3 of them children, banal conversations that had become intelligence for their murderers. But the most disturbing part began on page 127. The detailed operational plan. It was not improvised. There were protocols, forms, checklists. Protocol, Level 3 Cleanup, Complete Family Group Elimination, the title read. There were boxes to be checked: full sedation, separation by gender, staggered elimination, multiple remains disposal, as if they were livestock in a slaughterhouse, not human beings with dreams and families. The execution timeline was precise to the minute. 0500, separate targets. 0600, transfer Group A, adult males. 0645, execute Group A. 0800, transfer Group B, juvenile males. Or 900, process Group B at alternate facility. Each life was reduced to an entry in a schedule, each death programmed like a business appointment. The orders came from the very top. Page 156 contained the original authorization, signed with the pseudonym El Señor de los Mares, a signature that experts would recognize as authentic to the Pacific Cartel. Below it was the countersignature of Commander Elizalde with his badge number. And below that, a stamp from the Mazatlán mayor's office with initials corresponding to the mayor's chief of staff at the time. The budget allocated to the operation made the level of resources involved clear. 500,000 pesos from 1992, the equivalent of several million today, broken down into surreal line items. Veterinary-grade sedatives, 5,000 pesos. Crematorium fuel, 15,000 pesos. Quicklime 2 tons, 8,000 pesos. Gratuity, hotel cleaning team, 20,000 peso. Miscellaneous bribes, Marina Transit Police, Civil Registry, 150,000 pesos. Death had a price and it had been meticulously accounted for. Pages 200 to 250 contained photographs that no human being should ever have to see. The family in a warehouse on the island, bound, some of them bleeding, the faces showed a progression from terror to a hollow resignation. One photo showed Doña Carmen hugging Carmelita as the little girl cried. Another captured Roberto tied up, trying to reach for Luis Miguel. The twins were holding hands as if to ensure they wouldn't be separated, not even in death. There were videos, too, on deteriorated but digitized VHS tapes. One showed the moment the children were sedated. Elena's screams as she watched her children lose consciousness were audible even through the degraded audio. Another video, shot at the ranch, showed the hitmen preparing the graves, joking as they dug. One of them remarked that it was easier than planting corn, the banality of evil in its purest form. Page 275 began the confessions, not from the criminals, but from the victims. They had forced Roberto to write a letter admitting to embezzlement, threatening to torture his children in front of him if he refused. His handwriting trembled, There were stains on the paper that looked like tears or blood. Miguel was forced to sign documents transferring non-existent properties. They even made Roberto Jr. write a note claiming he was running away with an imaginary girlfriend. All of it to create a false post-mortem narrative. The most heartbreaking testimony was from Sergeant Luis Herrera, the policeman who developed a late-stage conscience. 20 pages handwritten, the script growing more erratic with each line, as if the weight of his own words was breaking him. He described how Elena begged until the very end for the lives of her children, not for her own. How Don Joaquín, 68 years old and badly beaten, tried to shield his wife with his own body. How the children— Herrera couldn't finish that part. The sentence was cut short. The children were screaming for their— A note in the margin in a different hand read, Sergeant Herrera found dead, apparent suicide, April 13, 1992. Pages 300 to 350 detailed the cover-up operation. It was as elaborate as the elimination itself. Every trace of the Mendoza-Salazar family in Mazatlán was meticulously erased. The hotel employees who had served them were bribed or threatened. The waiters at the restaurant where they had their last dinner received visits that refreshed their memories about what they had and had not seen. The boatman who took them to the island disappeared that same week. His boat found adrift. They created an elaborate false trail, credit card charges from cities they never passed through. A hitman who vaguely resembled Roberto was filmed on security cameras in Tepic, Guadalajara, León. Telegrams were sent from offices where the clerks had been paid off. They even forged medical records showing that Don Joaquín had been treated in a Guadalajara hospital for a heart condition. Page 400 was perhaps the most terrifying of all. It was a list. Previous successful cleanup operations. Rodriguez Marquez family, 7 members, January 1989. Torres Hernandez Group, 5 members, June 1990. Salinas Rocha family, 9 members, December 1991. The list went on. Dozens of families, hundreds of people. The Mendoza-Salazar family had not been the first, and they would not be the last. It was an industry of disappearance. Each entry included the method of elimination, the officials involved, and the cost of the operation. Some had notes: witness to shootout, saw a drop, relative of political target, banal reasons to erase entire generations. It was an archive of a Mexican Holocaust that no one wanted to acknowledge. The file also included audio recordings, tapes on which Commander Elizalde could be heard coordinating with the cartel. His calm voice giving orders for murder as if he were ordering a pizza. The old men go to the mine, the kids to the oven, the old women to the ravine. Quick and clean, I don't want any trouble. In another recording, someone identified as the cartel's accountant discussed the cost-benefit of eliminating entire families versus leaving survivors. The mess of relatives searching for them costs more than a complete cleanup. It's an investment, not an expense. A particularly disturbing section documented the specific fate of the family's belongings. Roberto's video camera with hours of family recordings was destroyed, but not before its contents were copied just in case. Roberto Jr.'s audio recorder, filled with his sound documentaries, was analyzed for compromising information. Ana Helena's diary was read page by page, searching for any mention of what they had seen. They found a poem she had written the night before the fatal trip. The sea holds secrets in its blue depths. I wish I could dive in and find treasures to make my family happy. Unknowingly prophetic. Carmelita's drawings were catalogued. She had sketched a man who was watching them on the beach. The portrait was so precise that it was used to identify and subsequently relocate the police officer who had allowed himself to be seen. The 11-year-old girl with her crayons had unwittingly signed a man's death sentence. An entire family condemned for witnessing a murder. 11 lives documented as eliminated merchandise. If you don't share this, you are an accomplice to forgetting. Like this with rage, comment demanding that Mexico acknowledge it's disappeared. Subscribe because there is more, so much more to reveal. The detailed analysis of the file revealed something more terrifying than the murders themselves: the vastness of the complicity network. This wasn't the work of a group of rogue hitmen. It was an institutional operation where every level of government and society had a role. The Mazatlán Municipal Police had directly provided 12 officers, not as infiltrators or undercover agents, but as active participants. Sergeant Martinez, not to be confused with the officer who found the file in 2024, had coordinated the closing of all access points to the island. Corporal Rodriguez had altered the patrol logs. Officer Sanchez had provided the official vehicles for the transport, all with their names, photos, and badge numbers in the file. The state judicial police had gone even further. 6 agents provided intelligence on the family before they even left Guadalajara. They had investigated Roberto for his work at the SCT, Miguel for his finances. They had even reviewed the children's school grades, looking for something, anything, to justify what they were about to do. They found nothing, but that didn't stop them. The Navy, supposedly the least corrupt institution, also had its rotten apples. 2 officers had diverted the patrol boat that detected Roberto's distress signal. The major emergency call that sent them away had been completely fabricated. The officers received 50,000 pesos each to look the other way while a family was transported to its death. The municipal government didn't just know. It financed part of the operation. There were official purchase orders for quicklime, justified as construction material. Fuel requisitions that ended up at the clandestine crematorium. The mayor's private secretary had personally authorized the use of municipal facilities to coordinate the operation. The civil registry was crucial for the post-mortem phase. 3 officials worked overtime to create a false paper trail, apocryphal death certificates placing the deaths in Guatemala, exit documents for a trip out of the country that never happened. They even created fake birth certificates for Roberto's supposed children in the United States, part of a narrative that he had fled due to bigamy. Mazatlán's hotel network was an active accomplice. The Playa Bonita Hotel was no innocent victim. The file showed monthly payments from the cartel to the night manager for reporting interesting guests. There was a code. Government officials were birds. Businessmen were fish. Journalists were flies. The Mendoza-Salazars had been reported as big birds from the moment they checked in. The hotel maids were eyes and ears. Maria Hernandez, who cleaned rooms 201 through 203, had reported that the family had a new video camera, that the engineer had SECT documents, and that she had overheard the eldest son say he wanted to study journalism. Seemingly innocent information that contributed to marking them for total elimination. The local media was bought or threatened. 2 newspapers received 100,000 pesos each to not cover the disappearance. When Jorge Gutierrez tried to publish ads searching for the family, they were systematically rejected. A reporter, Carlos Mendoza, no relation from the Noroeste newspaper, had tried to investigate. He was fired immediately when he persisted he had an accident that left him paralyzed. The message was clear: there is no story here. The command structure detailed in the file was as elaborate as a corporate org chart. At the top, the leaders of the Pacific Cartel. Below them, a network of officials that included everyone from municipal presidents to street sweepers. Each level had specific responsibilities, established payments, and communication protocols. It was organized crime in its most literal sense. The most disturbing part was the routine tone of the file. Pre-filled forms where one only had to insert names and dates. Standardized codes. Level 1 cleanup for individuals. Level 2 for couples. Level 3 for entire families. There were performance evaluations for hitmen with categories like efficiency, discretion, and disposition. It was industrialized death with human resources metrics. One hitman, identified as El Tlacuache, had received a bonus for excellent handling of minors. Another, El Marino, was reprimanded for excessive use of force with the elderly. As if they were evaluating customer service employees, not murderers of children and old people. The file included a lessons learned section. They recommended not using the same mine for multiple operations. They suggested sedating minors first to reduce resistance from the adults. They advised having a trusted doctor on hand in case a target had a medical condition that could complicate sedation. Continuous improvement applied to genocide. The names exposed in the file painted a picture of institutionalized impunity. Commander Raul Elizalde Soto had not only coordinated the operation, he was promoted to Director of State Public Security in 1995. Captain Jorge Medina, the cartel liaison, retired with honors in 2000 and opened a private security company. Officer Sanchez became the chief of traffic. All were rewarded for their participation in the horror. A search in 2024 revealed that several participants were still alive. Elizalde, now 78, was living in a luxury retirement home in Guadalajara. Medina, now a respectable businessman, held multi-million-dollar government contracts. Two former municipal police officers owned restaurants in Mazatlán, likely laundering more than just money. The maid, Maria Hernandez, was still working in hotels, now as a supervisor, training new generations in the art of seeing without looking. The file also documented the chain of the post-operation cover-up. Between 1992 and 1995, 8 direct participants in the cleanup operation died violently. Not by divine justice, but because they knew too much. Sergeant Luis Herrera, whose handwritten confession was one of the few signs of humanity in the file, committed suicide 2 days after writing it. The boatman who took the family to the island was found floating in the sea. A municipal cop who had started talking after getting drunk turned up with 30 bullet wounds. Each death created more complicity. The investigators of those deaths knew not to actually investigate. The coroners knew the suicides were not suicides. The journalists knew not to ask why so many participants in something that supposedly never happened were dying. The circle of complicity expanded like ripples in water, reaching hundreds, perhaps thousands of people who knew fragments of the truth but chose silence for survival. A network of murderers protected by the very system they swore to serve. Many remain free, rich, and unpunished. If this does not outrage you, check your humanity. Share this now. Let every Mexican know how they operate, like this, to demand justice. Comment with the names of the disappeared you know. Let's not leave them in oblivion. November 2024 marked the end of the secret, but not the beginning of justice. When Officer Martinez leaked the file to independent media, he knew he was signing his own death warrant. The document went viral in hours, shared millions of times before it could be censored. For the first time in 32 years, the faces of the 11 Mendoza-Salazars appeared on screens around the world. Not as fugitive criminals, but as victims of a criminal state. The federal government was forced to respond. The president gave a press conference, lamenting the excesses of the past and promising a thorough investigation. Empty words for anyone who knows the system. The Attorney General's office announced the creation of a special unit to investigate the case. 6 months later, not a single witness has been summoned. The statutes of limitation have, conveniently, expired for most of the crimes. The few who could be prosecuted are in their 80s and 90s. Justice arrived too late, if it arrived at all. The surviving relatives received the answers they had sought for decades, but not the comfort. Jorge Gutierrez had died in 2021 at 79, repeating until the end that his sister had not abandoned them. His children, now senior citizens themselves, received confirmation of what they always knew. Their family was murdered by the state. But what can you do with that truth? How do you process that the same government now offering apologies is the one that killed them? Lupita Hernandez, Roberto Jr.'s teenage love, now a 65-year-old woman, could finally close that chapter. For 32 years, she had kept a candle lit for him, waiting for his impossible return. When she learned the truth, that he had died bravely at 17, trying to protect his family, she cried for the first time in decades. Not tears of sadness, but of relief. He hadn't abandoned her. He had died as the noble young man she remembered. The government offered financial compensation to the relatives, an insulting amount that wouldn't even cover the cost of their 3 decades of private searches. They also offered a memorial in Mazatlán, a plaque in some park that no one visits. The family rejected both. They don't want the state's blood-stained money. They don't want a memorial in the city that devoured their loved ones. Instead, they organized their own memorial. On April 11th, 2025, the 33rd anniversary of the murders, a mass was held at the Guadalajara Cathedral. The same cathedral where Don Joaquín and Doña Carmen had married 78 years earlier. For the first time in over 3 decades, the names of the 11 Mendoza-Salazars were spoken publicly as victims, not as fugitive criminals. Roberto, Elena, Miguel, Don Joaquín, Doña Carmen, Roberto Jr., Ana, Elena, Luis Miguel, Carmelita, Diego, and Daniel. Each name a life cut short, a story without an end. The mass was filled not just with relatives, but with hundreds of people who have their own disappeared, each carrying photos, waiting for their own revealing file, their own terrible truth. The Mendoza-Salazars became a symbol for the thousands of disappeared families in Mexico. Not the first, nor the last, but now the most documented. Officer Martinez, who leaked the file, disappeared 3 days after the document went viral. His family says he fled to the United States. Many whisper that he met the same fate as the Mendoza-Salazars. The disappearance machine is still running. It's just more careful with its paperwork now. Mazatlán is still a tourist destination. Families still arrive every Holy Week to enjoy its beaches. The Playa Bonita Hotel was demolished in 1993. Now there's a modern, all-inclusive resort. The Isla de Venados still offers tours. No one mentions the family who saw what they shouldn't have seen. The sea keeps its secrets. The ravines are silent with their stories. The abandoned mines are tombs without headstones. But something changed with the file's revelation. Now we know, with irrefutable proof, that the Mexican state has an industry of disappearance, that the policy is no body, no crime. It is not incompetence, but policy. That when a family disappears in Mexico, it is not a mystery, but a method. The Mendoza-Salazars were not lost, they were erased. They did not flee, they were executed. They were not forgotten, they were disappeared. The file also revealed a list of other similar operations. Dozens of families waiting for their own leaked file, their own terrible truth. How many files like this one are waiting in the basements of police stations? How many entire families have been erased from history? How many Mendoza-Salazars are in the clandestine graves of Mexico? The story of the Mendoza-Salazars does not end with the revelation of their fate. It is just beginning. Because now that we know the truth, we are responsible for it. Every time a family disappears, every time the authorities give explanations that don't add up, every time silence is imposed by fear, the Mendoza-Salazars die all over again. The file, Operation Cleanup SS-92, hidden for 32 years in the rotten archives of the Mazatlán police, confirmed that the Mendoza-Salazar family did not abandon Mexico or get lost along the way. They were systematically exterminated by the narco-government machine to silence witnesses to a murder. 11 lives from ages 11 to 68 were processed as waste. Their family love was their death sentence because no survivors could be left. 3 generations united in life were also united in death and oblivion, until a forgotten file returned their truth and their honor. This story is not the exception. It is Mexico's hidden rule. If you have a family, if you travel this country, if you believe this must stop, act now. Subscribe to this channel that does not forget. Share this on all your networks. Use the hashtag #Justice for the Mendoza-Salazars. Comment for every life lost. Activate all notifications. Do not let them be forgotten. Do not let this happen again. This is your channel for memory and justice. Because in Mexico, disappearing an entire family is as easy as deleting a file. But as long as we exist, as long as we remember, as long as we share, the dead will not die a second time. For the Mendoza-Salazars, for all the disappeared from Mexico.